time with talking about Robert Motherwell, and I think I showed you this image really briefly, and mentioned and kind of focus on the photo on the right, and mentioned that he gets this big show at MoMA in 1965. Keeping in mind that by the time we get to the mid 60s, pop art is really the big thing. So in a way, it's kind of a retrospective of his working career up until that point. That painting that's behind him was a more recent work at that time period. But I show this because he's the guy who's standing in the middle. He's in a very formal clothing and a tuxedo. He was somebody who was really comfortable in this kind of upper echelon of the art world. And really early in his career, you think of his networking in some ways, but really early in his career, he was participating. He was certainly going to the museum a lot, but he was participating, attending lectures, being a part of it, probably originally attending lectures and making connections. But then he began to be a part of symposia that the museum was holding and sponsoring. In 1949, he was a part of a symposium that was called The Artist's Point of View. And basically what it did is it was allowing artists to speak and allowing the people who were there at the symposium to hear what artists had to say as opposed to curators and art historians. And so this is a quote from his talk that he gave. And the whole thing's pretty interesting. But this is one of the things that he says, and this is, I think we talked about this last time too, just again really quickly again, that art is a form of action, a drama, a process. It's the dramatic gesture itself in modern times, not a religious content that accounts for art's hold on the minds of men. So one of the things he's referencing here is, he's thinking about art in the broader sense, kind of the history of art especially. And, keep in mind, MoMA is a museum that's focused on, modern art, so really from mid-19th century, forward into present day. But within the context of New York City, you've got lots of other museums, museums of contemporary art and modern art, but also a museum like the Metropolitan, which is an enormous collection and really provided this broad overview of the history of art. So, and what I'm getting at is within this milieu or this context of New York City, you've got a really well-educated, art, in terms of art. You've got a well-educated population. And so he's making this reference back to the history of art, particularly the history of Western art. And if you think about, especially if you think about like this, the content of the survey class, we spend so much time, especially from the Renaissance forward, focused on religious art and the religious content of art, because that's the really dominant forms of art that you see for several centuries, and that's what's informing more current time periods. Whether you've got artists who are working with that, or as more often in the case of modern art, working against it, or trying to figure out the other directions that art can go. So what he's saying is, and this idea of religious content is also connected to painting, which is narrative, tells established stories, is kind of illustrative in some ways. And for Motherwell, the art of his time, in this time frame of the 1940s, the paintings have content, but they don't necessarily have subject matter, and that's something we've talked about, and that's something that also Greenberg was really keen on. So what he's emphasizing here is that art is a form of action, a drama, a process. That's really significant, because what we're looking at is painting as a kind of record of the artist's actions. So we're not necessarily looking at it in the way that it had been looked at in past times, in terms of thinking about what does it mean, what is it about, and so on. Probably certainly people then and now still consider these things. But you have to approach the painting differently than you would have, say, a painting from the 17th century or a painting from the 14th century. The methods of looking at contemporary within this time frame, or abstract expressionist painting, it just doesn't work the same way. It kind of fails if you try to do that. Another good and interesting quote by him, and this I think is an important one too, is he says, and this is not from that lecture, this is from a later time. He says it's not that the creative act and the critical act are simultaneous. It's more like you blurt something out and then you analyze it. And I think that's really significant as you're looking, especially as you're looking at abstract expressionism, because for a lot of the artists, what they're doing is working, right? And in some ways, they're working very intuitively, but they're also working very analytically and critically. And in some ways, the process becomes make the work, step back away from it, and then figure it out. Is that a process that sounds familiar to you, or that you feel like you do by chance? Yeah. Does that seem like relatable, I guess, in some ways, for those of you who make art? And I'm curious, do you feel like you're taught to work that way, or you just sort of end up working that way?
They emphasize on it. Like I've had several professors, especially in painting classes or drawing classes, that are like, after you've done a little bit, step back, look at it. But it also sort of just happens naturally.
Yeah. Did you want to add something to that?
Well, I mean, specifically with printmaking, I feel like if I do work spontaneously in that way, like stone lithography, for instance, it's not, I guess, fully accepted in the end. Like it needed to be printed out, or
yeah, or you mean, but to be accepted by you or accepted by somebody else? Yeah, well, yeah, that's what I was going to call them out. Yeah. So there, and and it's interesting too because you mentioned painting, you mentioned printmaking, and processes are so different. And and probably really for any media there is a certain amount of planning that has to be done. But again, that's going to depend depending it's going to vary rather depending on exactly what it is that you're doing. But certain types of processes like printmaking or photography or maybe even digital. I can see that as well. There's certain things you have to do to make the image, and so you can't be too, spontaneous. What was that?
I'll say graphic design, because I'm a graphic designer.
Yeah.
All of that is just planning and managing and planning until you get to the point where you're actually making the project.
Yeah. So I think some media and some processes, it would be, it certainly would be a little bit harder to do. But this idea of putting the work out there and then stepping back and thinking about it, I think is something that becomes increasingly understood. I think certainly within this time frame. I think there's these concepts of just make and make and make and make, and then you can edit, come back later, figure out what's working, what's not working. Like, perhaps even in a lithographic process, and I don't know that you would because it's so much work too, but you want to make things and then figure out what works and doesn't work and then, kind of adjust, in that way. So maybe you could, but enough, carrying the stones around and, all that grinding and stuff that, you feel would wear you out, literally. But I think that this idea and this method of working is something that, not, and again, this quote isn't connected to 1965 per se, but this is an idea that's really being promoted in the 40s, and as abstract expressionism is developing, and it's connected, with that work that has the appearance of being, very, spontaneous and is, to a certain extent. But one of the things that we'll sort of learn as we move along, and especially as when we talk about Jackson Pollock's work, is that it's not necessarily chaotic, and there is a kind of planning that occurs, even though there may be, even though at the same time we can talk about the spontaneous act of creating the art itself. But I think it's a generalized concept about art making. This is a newer way of thinking about art making, and also, keep in mind it's in this post-war period of time that we see a new kind of professionalization of art in terms of as a professional practice that's coming into play. There are graduate programs and what we think of as the MFA program that for the first time is going to develop in this post-war period, and it's going to put a lot more emphasis on conceptualization and understanding process and creating or developing or teaching artists who can talk about their work. And Motherwell plays into that. If you think about him within this time frame, he was somebody who was really articulate and well-spoken, and people listened to him. He was a good speaker, and he spoke to significant audiences in New York. So he has into that really important art world that is in New York. So he has a lot of influence in this respect. So long story short, going back to that. into that. So he's somebody that I think we often think about, the big abstract expressionists like, Pollock and de Kooning, that Motherwell sometimes is seen as one of the lesser ones, but he's really influential within this time period. As we shift to talking about Pollock, we're going to talk about him within these categories. So he's in that general category of abstract expressionism. The type of work that he becomes known for, we could define as either action painting or gestural abstraction. Those are two terms that are commonly used to talk about his work. But that's specifically the work that he begins doing in the late 40s and on to the early 50s until the time of his death in the middle of the decade. But even at the time of his death, he was beginning to shift gears, and he was starting to go back toward bringing the figure into painting again. So we'll talk about Pollock today, and we'll really kind of we'll continue talking about him on Monday as well. So we'll kind of probably split it out between two classes. So keep that in mind. With Pollock, I think it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about the myth of Pollock or the characterization of Pollock. I think this is a good photograph of him to look at. Because in some ways it's kind of typical of the way Pollock is thought about, or the way he's imagined, or the way we imagine him, in a lot of ways. Based on what you know about Pollock, if anything, and if you don't, that's okay too. You can still look at this image and analyze it. What does this image tell us about him? It might be based on what you know, or you could just be reading the image, itself. What do you think about him based on this?
He seems to be really down to earth.
Okay. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. I heard down to earth first. So what makes him seem down to earth?
Well, he's not formally dressed at all, and he's got a cigarette hanging on his lip, and he's not trying to pose. It seems like he's not really posing anyway. That might be his natural.
Yeah, it's kind of scowl, like his face is kind of messed up because he's trying to keep the cigarette from falling out of his mouth or something. He's wearing denim. He's got the denim jacket on and paint on him. Somebody up in the front row said, I wasn't sure if he was, or maybe middle. Oh, there, right there.
I just thought it looks like he's trying really hard to look like the rugged cool guy. I think it looks like he's posing.
I think so.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think you're right. It's a more informal look and more informal image, especially for the time period. But it does, I agree. But I think it's informal but posed in a way, because clearly, like, he's in his studio, he's leaning up against the wall or standing close to the wall. There's a work behind him, but he's kind of off. It's like the photographer said, okay, stand and move off to the side a little bit, create an image view, and your work, to kind of put two and two
Yeah, sort of
together.
this like advertisement appeal to kind of like the everyday man, Jackson Pollock.
Yeah, you can imagine that, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, the true story, right?
For me, like his expression, it almost seems like he doesn't care what you think. He's kind of judging in his expression.
Yeah, you have a sense of I say critical eye and not eyes, even in a way, because you can barely see. You look carefully at the photograph, you can see his other eye, but it's he's kind of squinting. So yeah, there's an intensity, of that, certainly of that gaze. This idea of, Amy, how did you phrase it? Did you say rugged individual? Rugged cool guy, right? So the rugged cool guy. That's really significant. And that's part of the myth of Pollock in a lot of ways. I'll show you this other photograph of him. This is Pollock in Wyoming in 1927, so an earlier date. The photograph on the left is from around, I think it's the very late 40s. I'm not sure the exact date on it. Pollock grew up in Wyoming, so he grew up in the West. He actually lived in California for a while as well. This also, to me, seems like a posed photograph as well. But one of the things about the myth of Pollock and also of the painting, especially the all over drip paintings that he becomes so famous for, is oftentimes curators and critics and art historians will talk about how the paintings are big and they're vast and because some of them really are on kind of mural size scale in some cases, and they're like the wide open spaces of the American West. So they really kind of make a lot of emphasis on that. There are also some other, as we'll see, there are some other things where he's being influenced by some, and it's really more conceptually, but he's being influenced by Navajo sand painting, which was something that he knew about and was interested in. And again, we'll kind of break that apart as well. And I find that really interesting. And that, in part, for me, I know that it comes from the fact that I grew up in the West, and so I understand those Western spaces. I also realize that I have a certain kind of bias as well, because I remember learning about Pollock, or I'll come across something that talks about, he's a cowboy from the West, and so this idea of the rugged, cool guy, he's like a Marlboro man or something, And then at some point I learned that he grew up on a sheep farm, and my family background is like farming and cattle ranching, and I was like, oh, it's a sheep farm, and I was like, oh, that's a Western bias, the battle between that cows are cool but sheep are not, and I kind of caught myself, in that, because someday I was like, oh, Pollock is a sheep farmer, right? And I was like, oh, that's my dad, talking. But I think it's interesting, based on our backgrounds, that sort of comes out of my background mythos, in a way. But just this idea of the West being associated with all of these things, wildness, wide open spaces, the rugged individual, the cowboy, and so on. All of these things really help, to really develop that myth, the myth of the artist, the myth of the modern artist, the American artist, but certainly of Pollock himself. The other thing about Pollock too is that as we look at the development of his career in the 1930s, he is working with Thomas Hart Benton on WPA projects. Just as a reminder, this is one of Benton's paintings, and I did put the date here, it's also from the 30s, The Ballad of the Jealous Lover. And typical of Benton's work, it's narrative, it's telling these stories, there's a lot of naturalistic detail, but there's also, a certain amount of abstraction as well. And typical in Benton's work, you see these landscapes that kind of swoop and kind of, come up and down, and there's a lot of, kind of visual dynamic energy in the images. This painting on the left called Going West is really small. It's really just an oil sketch. But you can see here where Pollock has absorbed Benton's style. I think in a lot of ways you see a lot of comparisons between the two. Also keep in mind too that a lot of WPA painting projects in the 30s were mural projects. Were projects in which you were painting on a big scale. And so that's another influence on Pollock and other artists in this post-war period who had experience in the WPA program, in whatever way, is that murals were really a significant form of artistic expression in the 30s. And then as we get into the post-war period and abstract expressionism, we see these big paintings that are on they're abstract, non-representational, not narrative, but they're on mural. Many of them are on the size of or on the scale of a mural. So we can see those kind of correspondences there as well. The other thing about Benton too, remember he was the artist who tended to kind of politicize the arts and characterize modern artists in a not very nice way. And Benton was from Missouri, and Missouri, in the 19th century was the western frontier. We consider it Midwest today, but it was considered kind of one of the western U.S. Previously. And Benton, really had this idea, or really emphasized the importance of American artists as these tough guys, right? Not these effeminate, elitist, culturati, from Europe, but these real American men, And sometimes I feel like Pollock, probably, worked well with Benton in that respect because they had, Pollock would have fit Benton's, ideal in this respect as an artist and particularly as a male artist and a male modern contemporary artist as well. When we look at the work that Pollock is doing in the early 40s through the kind of early to mid 40s, this work here called Pasiphae is really typical of his style. And does anybody know who Pasiphae is? Figure from mythology. Do you know about the Minotaur? Everybody knows the Minotaur. Pasiphae is the mother of the Minotaur, and so she's connected. She's connected to the story. And as you look at this image, can you see anything in it? Because there is some representation in this image. There's a lot of active brushstrokes and abstraction. There's something there.
There's a figure in the center. You can make out like its feet toward towards the right side of the image.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like here, that was like toes
Yeah.
in a way of some kind. Yeah, anything else? You try to think about this in terms of its composition. Yeah, it seems to be like a full standing figure here. I see a head, torso, legs.
Looks like there's the whole Minotaur figure, and then there's somebody riding him. You can see his
Yeah.
feet and stuff.
So maybe a head here, a figure.
It looks like there's a lot of faces around like the edges. There's a lot of different faces.
Yeah, with these kind of curling marks that you see. Anything else? Does it remind you of anything that you've seen? Something really ancient, actually? Yeah, the bull, what's sometimes known as the bull leaping fresco. And so we look at this image here, and the title, I think, might help you get there. You think because it makes you think about the Minotaur. There's a pattern here that's really similar. This form that you see here, the leaping bull at the center. We see here there's two standing figures, on either side. I think a figure here is more easily readable, a little less hard here, but the more you look at it, you begin to see like the face, maybe references to torso, legs, and so on. Then the figure that's leaping over kind of on the bull, it seems like that kind of representation with these black lines here. And so I think this is kind of interesting because here we're seeing a modern artist who's looking back to the ancient past, and he's showing an interest in the ancient past. The Knossos was a place that was excavated and a lot published on it in the 19th century. And so it was something that, especially for somebody studying art, would be something that would be certainly be well known within Pollock's time as it is today. But one of the things about, Pasiphae and the story of the Minotaur is that it had a lot of relevance, especially through the 1930s, because the surrealists were really interested in this concept of the Minotaur, this idea of the Minotaur. It's half human, half animal. The other thing about the Minotaur is that Picasso, in particular, who's like a superstar, especially in the first half of the century, he created a lot of images of the Minotaur as well. And so this he saw himself as a Minotaur in a way, sort of it became sort of a kind of personal symbol. So if you think about modern art within this time period, this is something that's kind of in the air. There's some other artists in the 30s who are working with images of the Minotaur. There was a surrealist journal that was called Minotaur, or in French, was a French journal, or the Minotaur. So the idea is out there, and we can see Pollock reflecting on that. The other thing about Pollock in this time period too is that he is undergoing Jungian analysis. So and it's a psychoanalytic technique. I'll read through this quote and explain some things about it in a moment. And do you guys know about Carl Jung? Does that ring a bell? Like I'm curious, before we talk about this quote and put it in the context, when you think of Carl Jung, what do you think of? Like what comes to mind?
I have a book of his symbols.
Yeah, man and his symbols. Yeah, that's a classic. Do you just do you want to talk about that at all, or just?
I haven't really read through it. I mean, I skimmed through it.
Yeah, it's an easy book to kind of flip through and go, ooh, and read a
Yeah,
couple things.
especially
You
go
kind of
back
check
to
around
the
with it.
index and look at the ideas that he's created these symbols for, and said, this is really kind of what it means. And
Yeah.
all sorts of
And that book
things
has
like
been really influential for lots and lots of artists because it is about symbols and symbolism and how ancient symbols kind of we reflect them in contemporary times, and so there's certainly relevance there. What else about you? Somebody saying something? Yeah, schools of thought. So there's Freud on one side, Jung on the other. Jung begins, if I remember correctly, Jung begins as a student of Freud or studies with Freud, something like that. But then he breaks away. So they have a similar kind of background. This idea of psychoanalysis itself, that you can study the mind, that people who have mental illness or a kind of neuroses, that you can provide them with they can study themselves in a sense. Psychoanalysis is oftentimes referred to as the talking cure. And this idea that you meet with a therapist or an analyst, as they'd be called in this context, and they help you to process things so you understand yourself better. you understand something like Jung, the idea is you want to understand your own symbols, archetypes, which we'll talk about in a moment, better, and that'll help you to, live a more, healthy life, as it were. So Jung and Freud have very some different, similar background, but they diverge and they go in different ways. So this is a photograph of Jung earlier in the century, and Jung develops this concept known as the collective unconscious, which is kind of interesting because when he's developing this idea, it's really theoretical in a lot of ways, and some really more recent research that's at least being released just in the last few years is really supporting it in terms of neuroscientists, people who are studying the literal physical workings of the mind, and also people who are studying DNA and how DNA functions as well. We'll come back to that idea in a moment. So this is a quote from Carl Jung. He says, "My thesis then is as follows: in addition to our immediate consciousness, which means our waking reality, which is of a thoroughly personal nature, and which we believe to be the only empirical psyche," and remember that word psyche means mind. Even if we tack on the personal unconscious as an appendix, there exists a second psychic system of a collective, universal, and impersonal nature, which is identical in all individuals. So that's kind of a crazy idea, I think, in some ways, is that we've got our own mind, right? That's totally, it's just us, right? It's our own special thing. There's not another one like it. But he's saying at the same time, there's another part of our mind that we share with everybody else. And that's I think, the challenging part. And yet that's what he's referring to as the collective unconscious. And he says this collective unconscious does not develop individually, but is inherited. It consists of pre-existent forms, the archetypes, which can only become conscious secondarily, and which give definite form to psychic concepts. So we'll try to unpack that a little bit. So what he's saying is that there's, our mind, there's our waking reality, there's our unconscious, that's the deep part of our mind that we don't have direct access to, but we can access it through our dreams by trying to understand our dreams. So there's that part of us which is really totally individual, right, and very particular to ourselves. But he's saying there's also this other thing, the collective unconsciousness, which is something that we're getting genetically, right? We're getting it through our genes, and it's something that we're inheriting. And it's carrying something, it's carrying information. And if we think about it genetically, what he's saying is it's carrying information from the past, right? So information from the past is coming to us and into the present. He's referring to these things as archetypes. And he's saying they only become conscious secondarily. And what he means by that is they're there, but we may not be aware of them unless we really try to figure it out. Unless we really, something you could do through Jungian analysis, unless we really try to pay attention to them and really try to find them, right? They're kind of like, but I don't know if this is a good metaphor or not, but it's kind of like a program that's running in the background, right? It's doing these things, it's affecting the overall, running of a machine or something, but you don't necessarily see it on the, on front. You don't see it on your desktop, but it's running, somewhere in the internal, part of the machine itself. And he says, so it's which becomes conscious secondarily, and which give definite form to certain psychic contents. And so what he refers to there is that those archetypes are going to affect us in our daily lives, whether we're aware of it or not. So for somebody like Jung, and this is where he's taking a Freudian idea and moving it in a different direction. For Jung, he says all of these things that are operating under the surface, affect us for good or for bad. If they're bad, you can try to figure them out and try to change things, and they, can function better. And Jung, in a sense, is saying the same thing, that there's all of these things, too, that are running under the surface, and that if you're more aware of them, ideally you can function better or more clearly or, more articulately. As the case may be. Does that make sense? Kind of? Does that help that make sense? Because it's kind of complicated and kind of weird, in some ways. Now, in terms of contemporary research, the crazy thing is this morning I was just kind of looking through some, I'll confess I was on Facebook, and I saw this study pop up, and I kind of saved it for later. I was like, I should read that later. And it was a reference to an article which was talking about some research And this is just from reading the headlines, literally like an hour and a half ago. So I haven't read the whole article, but it's saying now that that scientists believe that phobias can be transferred through your DNA. So you may inherit a phobia from your ancestors, and that's essentially what Jung was talking about, in some ways. So Jung is, working with this idea, really early in the 20th century, and now the science is kind of catching up to it, which I think is really interesting. And there's some other studies that have been released in previous years that have shown that people's physical experiences can show up in DNA generations later. So DNA functions very differently today because it was always thought that DNA is just this genetic material, but now we realize DNA can maybe contain other things or hold other things like physical experience or emotional, psychological experiences as well. So it's kind of heady stuff, and I think it's very interesting. And it was certainly, Jung was of great interest to Pollock in particular, even the fact that he was, Pollock was seeing a Jungian analyst, so when he's creating these paintings. So as we look at these works, and he's essentially making these references back to these archetypes of the past. And again, an archetype, that word itself means it's an ancient form. You just break that word down. Arc is referring to, I think, archaeology, ancient, old. Type is that word literally means form, so old form. It's these old forms come into the present. For Jung, he was really interested in, because he's got a scientific mind, and scientists like to categorize things and understand connections between things. His goal was to try to figure out, well, what are these archetypes? So he had different types of archetypes. And if you're interested in Jung at all, the Man and the Symbols book that Samantha mentioned is really good. I'm sure our library has it. I'd be surprised. You might even be able to find like a PDF of it online or something. But it's been hugely influential since it was published. And Jung was really interested in art because he felt that art was an expression of symbols. And symbols and archetypes, really go hand in hand. So it's it goes back and forth. So for somebody like Pollock, we see it in Pasiphae, where he's kind of bringing these archetypal ideas or these old ideas back into play in a more contemporary, into a contemporary present. This is another quote from Jung where he says, "Man's task," right? And Jung's coming out of a very patriarchal time and culture, so we could say human beings' tasks or humanity's tasks, if we want to broaden that, is to become conscious of the contents that press upward from the unconscious. So that's what Jung is really interested in, is how are these deep-seated ideas that affect us, that are running in the background, basically. That it's important for us to be aware of those things and to try to make sense out of them and understand how they influence us. And that's what he means by how they press up from the unconsciousness. And in Pollock's work in this time frame, that's essentially what he's doing. He's looking for archetypes. He's responding to archetypes. But certainly they're going to be ones that he knows. He's studied art. He's aware of history. So these are ideas, and also these are connected to Jung's interest in symbols and the collective unconsciousness as well. We begin to see this kind of pattern in Pollock's work at this time period, both in terms of the content, but also formally as well. So this painting here, done right around the same time period, called Guardians of the Secret, in a lot of ways is really similar to Pasiphae in the way that it's structured, where you have these tall vertical forms on either side, that kind of flank what almost seems like a panel, in the center here. The thing I find very interesting is if we jump back in both of these paintings, this form that's in the center, kind of the proportions, or actually they form the shape or shapes that's in the center, it's kind of the proportions of a mural. And it becomes the proportions of, in some ways, of his later work. But, again, when I say later, it's really just a few years later. So we look at Guardians of the Secret. Do you see anything in here that looks recognizable?
Animal.
Yeah, an animal. What's that? Does an animal remind you of anything?
The Egyptian gods.
Yeah, which Egyptian god? Anubis, right? Very good. I like it. Reminds me of Anubis, too. And even the title of it, Guardians of the Secret, that's kind of a compelling title, guardian there. We think of the idea of a guardian. It's not necessarily that they're guarding something, but they're protecting something. And that's sort of the part of the idea and of that word. And then this idea of secret, right? A secret knowledge in the sense of what is the secret.
It has this real sort of stereotypical layout of hieroglyphs. Like you have these two large structures that are pillars, and you have like a wall that's in between them with the glyphs on the wall.
Yeah. And if you think about Egyptian art, we can think of certainly other cultures, but if we're thinking in this case about Egyptian art, those are things we associate with Egyptian art. This, language that's unreadable, unless you've studied hieroglyphics, and it does look glyph-like, or like pictograms. You also see repeated forms in the same way if you're looking at hieroglyphics, even if you can't read hieroglyphics, you see patterns, right? Between the language, the shapes of the language that you see. And when you look at Pollock's work, you'll see these repeated lines. And I'll draw attention. You'll see if you look through all of it, you'll see that there's almost like a vocabulary in a way. You'll see certain repeated marks, or in terms of mark making. But especially this one here, I'll draw attention to that because if you imagine making that form, it's this kind of loop, right? And so it's kind of up and down, and so on. Keep that in mind because when we look at his big all over drip paintings, we won't look at it today, but on Monday when we come back, we'll look at a video of Pollock painting, and it's the pattern of when he's painting, even when he's painting and creating the work on the floor. So it's this repetitive, this kind of repetitive motion that's at play. But to come back to the content, this animal down below looks a lot like Anubis, who we can see in this Canopic container up here, who also appears here. There are lots of these scrolls that are referred to, collectively they tell a story that's known as the Book of the Dead. There's some really famous ones. There's one in the Metropolitan Museum that's very well known. This might be a detail from that one. And basically, Anubis it helps to convey souls, the souls of the deceased. They go through a series of trials. This is one of my favorite images, I think, in the history of art, where you've got Anubis here. I forget the name of this, I don't know what you call it, demon deity or something. Is this strange creature that will eat the souls of the dead if you're not careful. It's kind of like a guardian of hell, in a sense. And so you've got Anubis here who's leading the soul of the deceased. They're going to determine here whether the heart of the deceased, which is on this side, is lighter or not than a feather, right? So if the heart is heavier than a feather, the soul gets tossed to the horrible creature that's going to eat it. But if the heart is lighter than a feather, and you can see here that it is, then they get to proceed, forward to a paradise afterlife. So kind of compelling imagery. So if you look at this image by Pollock and you think about Anubis and you have an understanding of who Anubis is as a guardian and a protector, but also the person who allows you or helps you to get access to the next level, in a way I think that's certainly relevant. Because especially if you think about Jung and analysis and what that's and Jungian analysis and what that's all about, it's about trying to kind of be able to pass between those levels of your consciousness and your unconscious, to understand what's down below that you don't fully understand and kind of bring it up to the surface, to your consciousness, to where you can understand it. So a lot of this work, from the early 40s is really typical, or it's really characteristic, I should say, of Pollock's thinking, right? His experiences and what he's thinking about. And the work has these elements of representation as well. You see things in there that look like something else, like making references to a gold-leafing fresco or making references to images of animus. A big change occurs both in terms of getting critical attention and kind of the rise of his position as an artist and a change in his style happens in the later part of 1943, and it's with the completion and the sale of this painting, which is simply called Mural. But if you look at this painting within the context of those other two paintings, those other ones are actually, I should have mentioned this, These other two are smaller. This one, Guardians of the Secret are in San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. The previous one, I don't remember exactly where that one is. And the reason that comes to mind is I've seen this painting in recent years, and it's not particularly big. You know, it's kind of what we think of as sort of a pretty typical medium-sized, you know, easel painting. The mural painting is big. It's really pretty long. And again, the proportions of this painting I think are interesting because I think they're similar to in shape, or I mean in terms of the mark making, the shapes and forms that you see similar to that too. What happens with this painting here is that in 1943, Greenberg is aware of Pollock, and for Greenberg, remember his idea, he's a formalist, and his idea about art in this time frame is that the best art is abstract and non-representational, that it's a pure painting. He's really interested in this idea of purity, and that it should be, in a sense, pure expression. It shouldn't be about any kind of illusion of the real world. To him, that's impure. And so these are ideas that Greenberg is really supporting and championing. Greenberg introduces Pollock to Peggy Guggenheim, and who lived in who's very wealthy. He lived in a fancy apartment building in the city, and she had a large space. And I don't think it was actually in her apartment. I think it was like in the foyer into the space, in this large open area. And she buys the painting and puts this work into that space. So, and again, this is kind of negotiated in some ways by Greenberg. This is a photograph to give you a better sense of scale. This is Peggy Guggenheim standing here. I think that might be, I don't think that's Pollock, I don't think that's Greenberg either. So this is Peggy Guggenheim with the dogs standing in front of the painting. It's not a great photograph. This is also a photograph of the painting when it went under conservation some years ago, and these are the museum conservators and curatorial team who are moving it. But I show you both of those images just to give you a sense of the scale of the painting and the size of it. So, he shifted gears from working on a painting, painting sizes that are, roughly about this big or so, to this really long, expanse. The other thing about this painting too is you see these repeated lines and these kind of curls and swirls, and it's that same pattern. Again, if we jump back here, it's that same pattern that you're seeing here repeated, and that kind of really becomes characteristic of his process in terms of the way that he's painting. But you tend, especially in the later works, you tend to lose it. It looks less graphic, but when you look for it, you can find it. Peggy Guggenheim is really significant in a number of ways. So she was the niece of, I've forgotten his first name, she was the niece of the Guggenheim who started the Guggenheim Museum, which is one of the other really significant museums in New York City. Especially, and it's focusing on modern and contemporary art. Peggy Guggenheim also had a huge interest in modern art, again, the art of her own time. But she didn't necessarily have the financial resources to found a big museum, like her uncle. But what she did do in the 1930s, so this is a photograph of this is actually a reconstruction of the gallery that she set up in the 1930s. It was called the Art of This Century Gallery. She was really supportive of surrealist artists in the 1930s. As you move forward in time into the 1940s and 50s, she's really supportive of abstract expressionism. So again, when the gallery is first set up, and she's got this really kind of crazy space, with these curved walls. But one of the things that's really interesting about this gallery is it functioned as a commercial gallery, meaning that artists have work in it, the work's there to be displayed and sold. But she also maintained a permanent collection, and so she also had space within the gallery which showed art in the way that we think of a museum, but on a kind of much smaller scale. So it was sort of quasi-museum, or maybe like half museum, half gallery in some ways, and was a really kind of interesting and significant venture for the time. So the thing about Peggy Guggenheim is she's really significant in the New York art world, and when she buys the mural painting, the painting called Mural by Pollock for her apartment and for her apartment building, people pay attention, and it really elevated Pollock into kind of into consciousness. We've got just a couple minutes left. I think what we'll do is we'll pause here. We'll come back to this on Monday. So he completes the painting in 1943. He's getting attention. Interestingly, he applies for a Guggenheim Fellowship in 1947 and receives it, and that also really helps his career. And I thought it might be interesting for us to look at his fellowship, what he says in his fellowship application, and what he says he's going to do for the application, or after the money.